Hey guys, on today's episode we're going to show you a much requested video, how to inspect and change ball joints on the Classic Mini. Now the Mini obviously is front wheel drive, and because of that it puts a lot of load onto the ball joints. Most of the cars that come into our shop we see have some play in the ball joints. It's a really common wear item, so even if you think that your car is fine, it's always worthwhile to check. Lift the car up, we'll show you exactly how to do this, really quick and easy, and then you can verify that in fact your ball joints are in good condition. So with the front of the car safely lifted up on jack stands, we're going to take the top and the bottom of the wheel and rocking it back and forth, we're going to check for play. So you can see here we got a lot of play. If we grab the sides of the wheels, besides the wheel actually turning, you can feel that there's no play here, just up and down. That usually means to me that it's the ball joints and not the wheel bearing. The wheel bearing will usually have play in all directions. But in order to verify this before we go and actually change them, we're going to lie on the ground and visually inspect.
So what we're looking for here is, these are the ball joints. There's an upper one here and a lower one here. Now because the weight of the wheel is pushing down on the lower one, usually you'll see most of the play in the upper one here. So if I rock the wheel back and forth, if you look right here, you can see it's moving. And that means definitely that the ball joint is shot. You can see a little bit of play also in the bottom one here. So this here is what you want to look for, and if you do see that, that means your ball joints definitely need replacement.
Little tech tip, when you are taking wheels off, I always like to put them underneath the car for two reasons. One is that it just takes it out of the way, so you're not going to be tripping over it, doesn't take up shop space. Second is that it's just a secondary fail-safe. If for some reason the car should fall off the jack stands, you at least have the wheel underneath. Might save your life if you are underneath it. So it's always a good idea. Just throw the wheels underneath here, keep them out of the way, and extra little bit of safety. So now with the wheel off, we can see what we're working with. Now in order to change the ball joints, you actually need to remove the entire hub and have it off the car. So in order to do this, you'll need to remove several things. First, you'll need to remove the big nut on the end of the CV here. There's a cotter pin, you take that nut off, and then you'll need to remove the brake caliper, 2 bolts on the back here. Brake caliper can hang loose, come off. And then there is the tie rod end here, the steering end. You need to take that off. And then finally, there are 2 nuts on the end of the ball joints, top and bottom. And with those removed, the hub and brake assembly, everything should be able to be removed, and we can put it on the workbench and change the ball joints there. So let's get to it. With the cotter pin removed, we can now take off the big nut that holds the end of the CV. Now, if you have an impact gun, sometimes you can just blast these off with the impact and you don't need to have a big breaker bar. But if you don't own an impact gun, what you'll need to do is get a breaker bar on the end of here and get someone to stand on the brakes. So it's important that you take this nut off before taking the brake caliper off, because obviously if the brake caliper's off, this is just gonna freewheel and you won't be able to spin it. But because I have an impact gun, should be fine. I'm just gonna blast this off, holding here by hand. So with the nut off now, I just want to make sure that the CV is actually loose within the hub. That way we can take it off. So I just use a little punch here with a tapered end so that goes into the end of the axle here, and with a hammer, I can see it's moving. Can verify that it's loose, and then we know that we can take off the hub from the axle. Now we can take the 2 9/16 bolts out of the back of the brake caliper, and the brake caliper come right off. Now's a good time to check your brake pads with the caliper removed. You can just take a look. You can see these are fairly worn. Probably need replacement pretty soon. With that, you can just tuck it out of the way. You can either hang it up with a bungee cord, or I like to just put it on the tie rod here. Not putting any load on the line. Next, take off the nut here that's on the end of the steering rack. Now before you take the nut completely off, the tie rod end here is actually a wedge shape, and what it does is it's interference fit with the steering arm. So it's actually, you can see, even though I have the nut loose, it's stuck in there. So what we're gonna have to do is essentially shake it free. And how we're gonna do that is we're gonna take a hammer and we're gonna hit the edge right here, not the top. We're gonna hit the edge of the steering arm, which comes out right here. what that will do, it will shake the interference fit loose, and you'll see this pop down, and then we can take the nut off. The reason we don't take the nut off is because if we were to take it off completely and you miss and you hit the threads, then you've then ruined your tie rod end. So what we're gonna do is just hitting the side here. I may take a couple hits and you'll see it pop loose. You can see it's loose now. By hitting to the side, we're able to loosen it off, and now we can take this off completely. Lastly, what we're going to do is take off the two nuts on the end of the ball joints themselves. There's one on the top here, one on the bottom. After those are loose, everything will be able to come free. Now, much in the same way as with the tie rod end, we're going to loosen off the nuts, but not take them off completely, because we're going to have to break the taper just like we did with the tie rod end. That one's loose. So now with the nuts loose, we have three different options on how we're going to break the taper on the ball joints. Now, because the ball joints are pretty big, that can be pretty hard to do. There's a couple different ways to go about it. The first way is to use, much like we did with the tie rod end, just a big hammer, and you want to hit it from the side on the upper control arm and the lower control arm, not hitting from the top, hitting from the side right here. And if you hit it hard enough, it will jiggle it loose and break the taper. You do have to hit it pretty hard and quite often, so this can be a little scary if you haven't done this before. The second option is to use a pickle fork. This has got a taper on it. What you do is you stick it in between the upper control arm or lower control arm and the ball joint right here, and you hammer it in, and the taper breaks the taper in between the ball joint and the control arm. Third and final option is to use one of these. This is a specifically designed ball joint breaker. So you put it in between and you turn the nut here, and it pushes down on the top and breaks the taper. So whatever option you choose, whatever works best. I think in this case we're gonna use the pickle fork, put it in there and break the taper. So that's the top one done. You see it's loose now. Now we'll go to the bottom one. Now everything's loose, we can disassemble everything and take it off the car. So first, I'll remove the disc brake assembly here. We're gonna take both the nuts off. Sometimes you'll find that the ball joint will be spinning and you can't take the nut off. What happens is you just push up with hand pressure and it'll put enough interference on the ball joint that you'll be able to take the nut off. Same thing for the bottom. Take the brake shield off. So now we're going to take the upper ball joint off, lower ball joint off, and then sliding the CV joint out, you have the hub just like that. And that's what we're going to take to the bench. With it locked in the vise here, we're gonna start just kind of taking things apart and cleaning it up just so we can see what we're working with. So with the ball joints, they have these little rubber dust shields. You just pop those off. And then with some paper towel, just start to clean things off. They are greased, so usually these are kind of greasy. And just to be able to see exactly what we have here, it's just a good idea to kind of clean it off. You can even take a little flathead screwdriver and kind of scrape some of the old grease off. And then we can see what we got. So the way the ball joints work is that there's a domed nut that sits on top here, and then this is allowed to revolve around in it. The dome nut in between here and the hub are a series of shims, and that moves the nut up or down and gives more or less preload on the end of the spigot here of the ball joint. And then the nut is retained by this piece, which you see around the perimeter here. This is like a lock washer. So what you do is when you tighten the nut down, you then fold up these sides against the edge of the nut, and that prevents it from spinning off. So in order to take this off, the first thing we have to do is bend these tabs back down, and then we can get a socket on the nut and spin it off. So I am going to use just a punch here. I'm going to go up to the top. Now with the lock tab flattened down, we can get a socket on here and remove the dome nut. Now what you're going to need is one of these. This is an 1.5 inch socket, and it's a long version. If you use the shorter version, you won't be able to get all the way down onto the nut because the spigot of the ball joint will interfere. So you need to make sure it's a long 1.5 inch socket. You might need to go out and buy one of these because they're not in normal toolkits, but you'll use it a lot with a Mini. So with that, with an impact gun or a breaker bar, you can put it over top. Now you can see there are 3 components to this. There is the dome nut, which goes on top. In between it sits the little spigot here, and then on the base there's this little guy. It sits in the bottom, and that rides against the bottom of this here and controls its movement. Now on the upper half of the ball joint, you will see there's just these 3 components. When we do the lower half, you'll see there's an additional spring that goes in between this piece and the bottom, and that's critical, but we'll explain that later. Now that everything's removed, we'll continue cleaning and making sure everything is neat and tidy. You will see on the base here that there is some shims, and if I pull the screwdriver in between, I can pull these off. Now with classic Minis, the ball joints are shimmable, which means that they have an adjustable amount of preload. Now this is good because you don't always have to replace the whole ball joint. The more shims that it has, the further up this sits, and therefore the less preload on the ball joint. Now what we can do is, in order to tighten this up, is we can remove some of these shims. This nut will then sit lower down, putting more load on this and making it tighter. So if you have sloppy ball joints, sometimes they can be fixed without having to replace them just by removing some of the shims. If you do have to replace them, the new kits come with a variety of different shim widths, and you can dial it in that way. So with these removed, I'm just going to go ahead and clean everything up so it's nice spick and span, and then we'll start putting it back together. And when we're reassembling them, what I'm going to do is, my experience has told me that because this one only has 2 small shims in it, and from the amount of play that it had, that I think this probably won't be re-shimmable. We're going to see though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove both the shims. I'm going to run no shims, and I'm going to put, everything's cleaned up. I'm going to put the little piece here back in, put the dome nut over top, and put this down. And then we're going to tighten this up. Now this dome nut gets tightened to 75 foot-pounds. So with a torque wrench, the socket, put it on top here, and tighten it down and see what happens. So with it locked down to 75 foot-pounds, we can now see what kind of play we have. And as you can see, this is way too loose. So what we're looking for here for the amount of play is a light drag across the whole range of motion. Now you should be able to move it by hand. You shouldn't need to put a pry bar on it or anything. However, it should be fairly tight by hand, and as you can see, this is too loose. So this ball joint in particular is going to be requiring a full replacement. So when you buy a ball joint kit, it will come with all the components shown here. Now there are provisions for an upper and a lower ball joint, as well as some shims. The difference between the upper and the lower ball joint is just this spring here. Now the spring goes into the lower ball joint, and what it does is keeps pressure on the ball joint, because if you think about it, the load of the car is being pressed up into the upper control arm, and the lower one is able to hang free. So this keeps the preload for the lower ball joint. So you'll see pretty much every component that we take off of the ball joint is replaced. You get new rubber seals, you get new lock washers, you get new the lock ring here that we had to hammer down. So it's really nice. You get everything replaced, and therefore you get everything new when you redo it. Because we're replacing the ball joint, we're going to be replacing this little lock collar here. In order to take this off, there's a grease nipple right here. You need to take the grease nipple off, and then it'll come out. So take that guy out. Now's a good opportunity to clean even more. Just make sure everything is free of dirt and grime. So now first step is we're going to put the new lock ring on top, orienting it so that the grease nipple can go back in here. So first put the lower piece in with the conical side facing up. And next we're going to be putting in the dome nut and the spigot here. And in between the nut and this piece goes the shims. Now, the kit will supply you with several different shims with different thicknesses. You can use a micrometer and see the different widths. I like to just go by feel. You can usually tell which ones are thicker than which ones. There's a really thin one here, a thicker one here. And what we're gonna do is just do sort of a guess and check. The quickest way of doing this I've found is to go with a size that you think might be about right. Check it. If it's too tight, you can pull out one of the thin ones. If it's way too loose, you can add a thicker one. So what I'm going to do for the beginning is I'm going to put one thick one here and 2 thin ones. That way I've got a lot of adjustment range. I can dial it in from there. So we're going to take these 3 shims. I'm going to put them on top. I'm going to orient this so that it's sitting right there. You can see it's sitting in the little piece on the bottom. And then we'll thread the new dome nut on top and tighten it up to 75 foot-pounds and see how it feels. So getting good at these is kind of a matter of feel. As I'm tightening this one up right now, you can see just hand tight that this is quite, I can feel the resistance and stiff. So I know once I tighten this to 75 foot-pounds, it's gonna be too tight. So already by feel, I can tell that. So what I'm gonna do is I am going to add another small shim to this one here to bring it up a little bit more. So I'll feel for it. This is the thinner one. I'm going to add that on top. Now you could put grease in here right now, which we'll do later, but I usually like to do it without grease right now, just so everything's clean and that the grease doesn't interfere with the fit of it. You can also put some lapping paste inside here. These ball joints that are being produced now are not as good quality as the ones from many years ago. And sometimes they'll have a loose spot, but then they'll be tight everywhere else. And in order to even it out, what you can do is put a little bit of lapping paste, valve lapping paste inside here and spin it with a drill or even by hand, just move it around and take out those high spots. It depends on the individual ball joint. You'll have to feel and see if yours needs it. These ones feel pretty good. So what I'm gonna do is just tighten it up here, see how I can get the feel, and then we'll take it apart and put grease on everything, put it back together, and then hit it again with the Zerk fitting to make sure everything's properly lubricated. So 75 foot-pounds, and I can tell that is way too tight. So you can see by hand I can't push this over, so that's definitely too tight. So that means that I'll need to add yet another shim. Now you can see I added another shim and now it's way too loose. So what I'm gonna need to do is, because the last shim I added was a thicker shim, I'm gonna need to take it apart and pull out one of the smaller shims, and that should be just right. I'm taking out one of the smaller shims here, more flexible type, putting it back together. Again, you sort of get a feel for this after you've done it a while. And it doesn't take very long, but you do sort of have to guess and check. Still too loose.
This is a real fat boy shim.
Perfect. All right, so I've got the correct amount of shims in here now. You can see that I can move this by hand, but it is got a light drag across all range of motion. You'll see like there. So it won't flop around, but I can definitely still move it by hand. that's exactly where you want it to be. So now that we know that this is the right amount of shims, what I'm gonna do is take it apart, put everything with a light coating of grease. The grease, beyond acting as a lubricant, also acts as a rust prevention. Because it's coated in grease, the insides of this won't rust, which is very valuable. So we're gonna coat everything in grease, put it back together, and then hit it with the Zerk fitting to make sure that the grease comes out and we have fully lubricated ball joint. So I've got a little bit of grease on my finger. I'm just gonna grease up all the contacting surfaces here of the ball joint. We're using a moly grease. Whenever there is a metal on metal surface, we use a moly grease. If you're doing something like a wheel bearing where there's actually bearings that are revolving around it, apparently moly grease is actually like too lubricating and the ball bearings won't turn, they will spin on the race, which will cause wear. So you want to use a more conventional grease for those, but for anything with a metal on metal surface, we like to use moly grease. With everything assembled and it torqued to 75 foot-pounds, we've greased it. The upper ball joint is now done, so we can flip it around in the vise and start working on the lower one. So we are going to continue to disassemble the ball joint much in the way we did with the upper one. It is the exact same as the upper one except for that one small part that we mentioned earlier, and I'll explain that when we get to it. So you'll notice when you're taking the lower ball joint apart that it looks exactly the same as the upper ball joint. You have the dome nut, you have the spigot here, you have the little spacer that it rides on. But then if you look down inside, you'll see, if you take a little screwdriver, you'll be able to pull up the spring. And that keeps a preload on the lower ball joint like we explained earlier. And when you are setting the preload for these, you want to do it without the spring. So we're going to take the spring out, and then we're going to set the ball joint just like we did with the upper ball joint. The reason for this is if you have the spring in there, it will give you a false reading where it'll add resistance where you'll think it's good, but once it's loaded onto the car, it'll be way too loose. So with the spring removed, we can clean everything up exactly like we did with the upper one. I'm going to try to re-shim with the current ones just like we did, and if that doesn't work, we're going to change them all to brand new. So now we're going to re-shim the lower ball joint. With the spring removed, we're going to put in this piece again, and then orient this in there, put the nut back on. Again, I'm using no shims in here because I just want to see if this will be tight enough without any shims. I'm going to lock this down and torque it up again to 75 foot-pounds. And that actually has a good amount of play, a good amount of resistance. You'll see some of these here where it's loose in this one section and it's tight over here. That's usually because of the way it's been wearing, where it's always kind of in a certain arc. I think for this one here that I'm going to replace it anyways. It feels a little loose over in the corner and it feels pretty tight over here. So I think just best course of action is to take it off and just like we did with this one, replace all the components.
tell that's already going to be too loose. So I'm going to take one of the smaller ones out. Now we've got the correct amount of shims and the preload is set on the lower one without the spring in it. What we're gonna do is disassemble it, put everything back in, including the spring with a light coating of grease, and then again hitting with the Zerk fitting to make sure it's fully lubricated.
And you can go in.
So now we've got them all assembled with the correct amount of shims. They're greased. The final thing we need to do is fold these lock tabs over so that these don't unwind themselves. So I like to use a set of channel locks, and you can grab it from the top here and just bend one edge over here. I like to do 2 edges. So that's one, and then we'll grab another one opposite and bend it over. If you're redoing these, try to grab an edge that hasn't previously been bent over, just be stronger that way. So with that tight against there, this is unable to spin out. Rubber seal on, and we're good to go. So installation is pretty much the exact same as the removal. We're gonna put everything back in. These top nuts that go onto the ball joints are torqued to 40 foot-pounds, so make sure to do that. And then when we get to the big nut here that goes on the end of the CV, there's a particular set of torque ratings that we need to do. We'll explain that when we get to it though. So now that we're all toasty warm with the fire, we have gone ahead and tightened up all the nuts and bolts on the hub, on the brakes, on the steering. Everything's ready to go except for the big one on the end of the axle here. Now, how we tighten this is dependent on the axle. There are 2 different types of axles. There's one with a single hole through it, and there's one with multiple holes. The end torque rating for the one with the single hole is anywhere between 188 foot-pounds and 200 foot-pounds. And with the multiple pin hole, it's 150 foot-pounds. So what we're gonna do first though is, because the wheel bearing is located within the hub right here, we need to pull the axle through, and that will seat everything in the wheel bearing. How we do that is we use a big washer. We've got 2 of the washers that go between the fan and the engine, just duct taped together. And I'm gonna put that over top here, and then we're gonna tighten this main big nut here while someone is holding the brakes. And we're gonna tighten it up to 200 foot-pounds. That's gonna pull everything tight and make sure that everything is aligned, everything is seated correctly. Once that's good, we're gonna back it off, and then we're gonna re-put it on without the washer so that we achieve the torque rating. In this case, it'll be between 188 foot-pounds and 200 foot-pounds. What you do is you set it to 188. If the split pin is aligned, then we're gonna put the pin in. If not, you continue to tighten it until the pin aligns, and that's why there's a variance there in the torque ratings. And that's it for the one side of the ball joints. Pretty much exactly the same on the other side. Usually with ball joints, they'll wear in pairs, so you want to make sure you check both sides and replace them both. If you own a Mini, you'll most likely have to do ball joints at some point in the car's life, so it's a really good thing to be able to do yourself. As you can see, it takes a little bit of time, but not too much effort if you do have the right tools. Hopefully this video can help you and you can follow along and do it yourself. Hey, if you like our videos, please like and subscribe. Really helps our channel. And if you have your own tips on doing ball joints or anything to do with classic minis, put them in the comments. We always like to hear what people have to say. And also check out our Patreon page. We do all this stuff in our spare time, and we'd love to be able to put out more content, and that really helps us with that.
Anyways, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.